Paul and Silas bound in jail had no money for to go their bail. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Paul and Silas began to shout. The doors popped open and they all walked out. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. The only chains that we can stand are the chains of loving hand in hand. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Well, I got my hand on the freedom plow. Wouldn't take nothing for my journey now. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on.
Good afternoon and welcome to this third day of our pilgrimage together, this virtual pilgrimage for racial justice, and welcome to this panel on building the beloved community together. It's important as we pray together and listen and learn together to begin to look at ways in which we might act together as we return from this virtual pilgrimage into our communities, into our neighborhoods in the weeks to come. I'm honored to have with us this afternoon, a remarkable panel of people of old and new friends. And we're going to talk together about their perspectives, about the witness of the church and what they hope. At the close of this session, we're going to ask you to share what you hope as the panel does the same. So we'll ask you to do that in chat at the end of our session together. Let's introduce our panelists today. First, the Reverend Brenda Husson is entering her 25th year as rector of St. James Church here in New York. Over her time as rector, she has deepened the church's sense of discipleship and increased its witness in the world. And the longer I know Brenda and see her leadership, the more I respect her for what she's done and what she's helping the whole church do. Patrick Chang is theologian in residence at St. Thomas Church here in Manhattan. He also works for the church pension group. His books on theology have become required reading in seminaries across the Episcopal Church. His doctoral work at Union Seminary was with the Reverend James Cone. Christian Peele, sometimes you meet somebody and you think they're amazing, and it turns out everyone you know already knows them and knows they're amazing too. So it's wonderful to welcome Reverend Christian Peele to our panel today. Christian is Director of Operations for Stop the Spread, a very present question in this time of pandemic. She has previously worked at senior positions at Riverside Church, was Deputy Director of Operations for the Obama White House. She's the youngest ever graduate of Duke Divinity School and preached her first sermon in William Barber's Church in Goldsboro, North Carolina. And finally, my friend of longstanding, Diane Pollard. All that we've done this week would not have been possible without Diane's leadership in the church, without what she's helped create in the church over the last 30 years. Diane is on executive council of the whole Episcopal Church now. She's been on speed dial for at least the last 3 presiding bishops. And we've worked together over these last several years for a camp in Harlem for Children for Education in the summer. Welcome to our panelists. It's wonderful to begin this conversation together today. The first question for our group together is talk about your sense of what beloved community means. Christian, would you talk to us about how you understand that call to action from Dr. King?
Absolutely. And thanks for having all of us. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you, my fellow panelists, and all of us listeners and strivers here together. My faith grounds my sense of what beloved community is and sort of drives the call within me for striving toward it. One of my favorite theologians says that the gospel does nothing less than cause a conversion of your very imagination. And what I think is so powerful about that is sort of the depth of beloved community isn't possible outside of a reshaping and renewal and rebuilding of what we think is possible. Our imaginations for what can be have to be refreshed in order to really strive for beloved community. The scriptural witness, I think, speaks to not a destination, but an ongoing journey toward the ultimate good, an ongoing journey in striving to love God, and an ongoing journey in striving to love each other. And I think that striving is at the heart of beloved community. It's messy, it's complicated, it's a lifetime of work, and it's incredibly holy and incredibly sacred.
Thank you, Christian. Brenda, what's your perspective? How would you describe this?
I love what Christian just said about a conversion of the imagination. That is a great phrase, because I know it's easy when people hear the phrase beloved community and don't explore its roots in the work for justice to think about creating a community where we all love each other. And the fact is that we can't all love each other unless we're really willing to do the hard work of struggling with and sometimes against each other, having some really hard conversations. One of the things that I often go back to is that we are so comfortable praying the Lord's Prayer and talking about on earth as it is in heaven, and then we just move on. And the fact is, on earth as it is in heaven is about building that beloved community now. And it needs to include people who are very different from us in every way imaginable. But if we really do that work well, part of what excites me is that I like to say when we get to heaven, when we get to the realm of God, we should recognize some of it because we have, in fact, made some of it visible here. That shouldn't be a completely foreign territory. And so often I think we look to the realm of God as outside over there and someday. And that's true in its fullness, but it needs to be also true in some particularities right now. And that's our work.
Diane, talk about your vision for this.
Well, it's interesting, and I can agree with my colleagues very easily. For me, the beloved community is a journey that's going to take us quite a while. It is not an easy fix. It is hard work, and the fact that we have been struggling to get there says to me that the work is really hard.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of truth telling in it and unmasking things that we may not be very happy when we see them. It's also an occupation, a journey, a task that we must take over a relatively long period of time, recognizing that we may never get there in our lifetime. And that's a very hard thing for folks to understand. I think that I'm heartened by what's going on today, because I think we're being pushed, kicking and screaming towards the beloved community by some of the things that are just happening around us, that are undeniable results of our not having done this work.
Thank you, Diane. Patrick, how do you understand this?
Thank you, Matt, for having me and your team, and also being part of this wonderful panel. I start with love, obviously, because love is part of the beloved community, but it's not just any love, right? I looked at Dr. King's notion of agape love, which is the kind of self-giving and sacrificial love of the cross, right? Dr. King in Loving Your Enemies, writes about you have eros love, not just erotic love, but the love in which it's for the sake of you, versus agape love, which is for the sake of the beloved. And I think, that's the starting point. That's where the beloved community comes out of, in addition to the imagination and the realm of God and the journey that my other panelists have talked about. The other thing I'd like to say is just that agape love is a non-binary kind of love, that it dissolves the sort of me versus you, us versus them. I think so much of what's going on in terms of sinfulness in our society today is about thinking in terms of binaries. And so agape love really dissolves that. It's like what our Father Duvere said about the I, thou, and the Buber thing, So I think that's something, I'd like to think about. And also, just as Niebuhr says, we can never get there, but we can approximate it in terms of justice.
So I want to talk now about the witness of the church at this moment. We've gathered really from around the country for these past days and are looking for both what we've done and what we can do. And Diane, so much of what's happening now is happening because of your witness and the witness that you've helped the church to take on. Talk about the witness of the church, both where we've come and where you see it now.
Thanks, Matt. Well, the church has been witnessing in different ways over a relatively long period of time, some more successful than others. When I start to think about my involvement in it, I go back to the Episcopal Urban Caucus and 40 years ago, when Paul Moore had first come to New York, and he gathered a group of people together in Indianapolis. We're supposed to be celebrating our 40th anniversary this year, but COVID-19 had different ideas. And we were multiracial, multi-ethnic, gay, straight, everything that you could possibly include. And we started what was then called a movement. Now, I see EUC as the church, although it is not a part of the organizational church. It's not and that's what I like about it. It bubbled up. I would then fast forward to 1991, where through, I think God had something to do with this, but the General Convention was supposed to be held in Phoenix, Arizona. And Phoenix, Arizona was the only state in this, Arizona was the only state in this union that had chosen not to approve a holiday for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. So a group of us went to the then presiding Bishop, Edmund Browning, who was a friend, and we told him we shouldn't go there. We have to do something. We can't go. So I guess what went on was a number of negotiating conversations about whether we should go, and if we went, what we would do. I'm not comparing us to Black Lives Matter, but I sympathize with I support Black Lives Matter, because they were me 40 years ago. and so I get them. I really get them. But anyway, the negotiation was that we would go, but the church would talk about race. And we went to Phoenix, and the House of Bishops devoted a good bit of time in talking about racism. Now, I'm not going to tell you that that was successful, but it was a start. At that time, the Urban Caucus developed a phrase, a church of all races and a church to end racism. And we had buttons and we gave them to everybody. And so there we are starting a conversation about race. Now, I've given a lot of thought to why the church struggles talking about race, and I prefer now to call it white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that the church struggles in that conversation because it is part of us.
Mm.
When we start to do the hard work and we look at our hierarchy of many years ago, and we look at who they were, and we look at their positions, and we start looking at the history of Confederate monuments, there's a truth that slaps us in the face that we cannot deny. And it's much easier to not engage in conversation than it is to engage. I would say that I am very, very cautiously optimistic these days. You really have to prove it to me before I move over from cautiously optimistic to optimistic. Because I think that through the death, or I should say, through the discovery of the death of people like George Floyd, like Breonna, like we now can't deny it. I would remind the church that, and the community and the world, that people have been dying the same way all over for a long time. In the way we credit the wheel to civilization, we may someday credit the cell phone to the beginning of the understanding of who and whose we were. So there's a lot of hard work going on. I also look at this week. I'm very, very honored and blessed to have been a part of this panel and to have been a part of this pilgrimage. I think it's a wonderful thing that you've done. But I also look at the numbers of people who are viewing it. And I look at where people are coming from. And I, as a person who participated with you last year in the pilgrimage, we were about 20 people, right? We came away, we learned a lot, we met wonderful folks, but I'm looking at the number right now and it says 172 people out there have been on this pilgrimage and they did not experience it the same way we did because it was a different kind of it. But we've had a chance to look together as a church and as a country, because not all of the folks viewing us are church people, which is the other, or our definition of church people. Everyone is a church person. Not that you don't have to go to church to be a church. But to that extent, that's why I feel that the church is moving, and that's why I'm hopeful about it.
Good. Thank you, Diane. Patrick, talk about the witness that you see for the church as a scholar, theologian, teacher. What do you see?
Well, I think I was fortunate to be formed in the Diocese of Massachusetts, and the witness of the late Barbara Harris and Ed Rodman, and then also sort of texts by Polly Murray. These are all the sort of saints in which I believe call us to beloved community. In terms of the constant circles that we go into over the last few days, right? I mean, whether it's slavery or whether it's lynching or Jim Crow laws or Emmett Till and then George Floyd, right, and Trayvon Martin, getting beyond the cycles, I think really, as I mentioned earlier, I believe requires getting beyond binary thinking, right? The good, the bad, the red, the blue, the body, the soul, almost going back to the Gnostics, like this either or thinking. And I think this because Jesus Christ is the ultimate non-binary, right? That in the incarnation, he blurs the divine and the human. In the death, in his crucifixion and resurrection, he blurs, death and life. Atonement, he blurs like sin and grace. So I think, the church is called to enter into this deeper thinking, I think, theologically, about how do we think beyond the binaries? And let me just give you a few examples of things that I haven't heard over the last 2 days. I became a theologian taking Dr. Cohn's class at Union because I was like, all right, everything is about black and white. Where does Asian fall in black and white, right? Not to take away from, sort of different experiences, but where's yellow in terms of black and white, and also the complexity, right? That anti-blackness within Asian communities, but then also what we're seeing now with the Kung flu, right? Which like became this whole thing in a church, right? I mean, people are going to get hurt and die because of that. But also other binaries like the US and the international, right? I mean, these issues are here, but we have slavery, we have, sort of thinking internationally in terms of borders. In the Anglican Communion, so often sexuality and race are placed as binaries, right? Like the global South is like, oh, you have to pay attention to race, not sexuality, and vice versa. So I think that's another binary to think about. And so these are just examples of ways I think the church can bear witness, not only in concrete ways, but theologically in terms of thinking in terms of beyond binaries.
Thank you, Patrick. Christian, you've been able to see the witness of the church from multiple perspectives, from the pulpit of a place like Riverside, which witness is so important to, and then from other sectors, including the White House. How do you see the church's witness from your perspective and your leadership?
It's a great question. I was thinking about what I might offer to this question. And I think about I feel my vision has been singular, especially in the last several weeks. When I think of, I try to call forward the church, I see the faces of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain and Trayvon Martin, and just the list goes on. And I see the shadows of the many represented whose names we will never know. Those whose lives were devalued, are devalued. When I think about the witness of the church through that lens, there is no greater sense of urgency. This work becomes deeply urgent and deeply embodied. And one of the things that came up in some conversation that we had before this in preparation was that many of the systems, and this has been said by my colleagues already, many of the systems within the church represent sort of dark systems, the darkest systems of our society. The church has also embraced those systems. We've also let ourselves off the hook, I think, as a church body in terms of education and educating ourselves so that we can engage not only our Sunday morning liturgy, but understand the economics of the world and recommend new economic systems for how we participate with each other and use our resources and our money. We've let ourselves off the hook in sort of reclaiming who Jesus is and who Jesus isn't, sort of rejecting writing things on to Jesus that make us feel comfortable about ourselves and help us say who's in and who's out, instead of really hearing the core of what Jesus' message offers. And I think too, it related to that and to your question directly, in every industry in which I've worked, government, nonprofit, and then in the church itself, there's always a gap. There's always a need for the church's witness. Our Christian story has something to say to the world, especially in crisis moments. Our ritual, our scriptural witness, our sacraments, our calendar has something to say about hope, something to say about beloved communities, something to say about an alternative witness. If we ourselves, members of the church, will be the first to listen. Even in White House spaces, as I was making decisions about policy or thinking about legislation, asking myself questions about the Christian story and what that says about the value of each life, what that says about the core of love and how you live that, was informing my thoughts even at that time. The church's, in conclusion, the church's witness can be alive and well if we'll be the first to take it seriously and to demonstrate that for the rest of the world and through the systems of the world, not just in our sanctuaries on Sunday morning.
Thank you, Christian. Brenda, you, over the last several years in St. James, have taken on significant witness and the kind of truth-telling that our panelists have described. Talk about where you've come and what St. James has done over these last several years.
Sure. It's funny, when I 25 years ago, was applying to become the rector of St. James, the reason that I was interested in St. James, though I'll be honest, I never thought they'd call me, was that of the big parishes in Manhattan, it was one which had actually had a significant history around justice, and most recently at that time against apartheid, in terms of divestment, in terms of all kinds of interesting ways we were able to support Archbishop Tutu, and also having done Nehemiah housing in the South Bronx. And so I was intrigued by that. But I was also aware, and as you mentioned in your introduction to me, that we had somehow, that had begun to recede, and we had also lost some focus on what it really means to be a disciple of Jesus. To really say, you know, I have to walk in that way. And so a lot of my first work was really on reacquainting people in more depth with the Bible, about what the story really is, about how radical Jesus actually is vis-a-vis the culture in which we all live. But over the last few years, we had done for our bicentennial a history of the church. And one of the things revealed by that history that our historian mentioned was that the Civil War never existed as far as St. James was concerned. We had done wonderful things to support people, parishioners who were fighting in the First World War, in the Second World War. Much was discussed and debated around Vietnam, but man, the Civil War never occurred, not in any minutes, not in any notes. And so that is not an accident. What that said very clearly is that leadership at the time, like many in New York who were deeply invested in the slave trade, were not in favor of ending slavery. They were dependent on slavery. And so that had been sitting with me. And as our diocese began to move more fully into the work of lamentation and reparation, I thought we need to go there. And we've now done enough that we can ground this theologically. We are not doing this because I, the rector, or some committee has decided this is an important issue. We are doing this because we cannot explore our history if we're going to be true to what we say we believe. And so I am really delighted to say that our lay leadership, our vestry in the Episcopal Church was really excited about this project and supporting it. We were able to utilize the gifts of a parishioner to start in that history using the John Jay Archive. And out of that came a real discovery of what our history was, which was slave owners among our vestrymen. And while we are now in a church that was built in the 1880s, it was clear that the slave trade had helped provide the wealth that made the founding of the church possible. And so we presented all that information to the parish over a couple of weeks of exploration. We actually brought the wonderful play that the diocese did as part of the Year of Lamentation to the church as this major lecture series we did, and it uses the actual words of both enslaved people and slave owners and music. I'm so excited to have Janina Otis involved in this pilgrimage because she was instrumental in that. And we also prepared a plaque. The founders' plaques are inside the church. You can find them there. They can stay inside the church where they are, but this plaque is right on Madison Avenue. And it begins by saying what I think is the most important way to approach this, which is Jesus saying, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." So we have that quote from John's Gospel, and then in solemn remembrance of the enslaved people whose labor made possible the founding of St. James Church in 1810 in Hamilton Square. And then beneath that, it says, Christ have mercy. That will be unmissable on Madison Avenue. And we want that admission and that repentance to be front and center in our identity. And again, the parish has been very excited about that. Excited as well. Last year, we did a class on systemic racism and Christian theology, and I was delighted. It was actually oversubscribed. We had to cut registration for that. And I am, for those who are from other places, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a majority white neighborhood, a majority white church. So this is, for us, a real move from saying we need to help people out there to saying we need to figure out who we are, who we have been, who we want to be, and not just say, oh, we're Christians, our hearts are in the right place, but know that we have to change what we know and what we do. And so we are beginning and developing now more ways to make our aspirations more grounded in present day reality. And that's been, I have to say, this work is one of the greatest joys as well as some of the hardest work I've done in my ministry.
Well, so Brenda, I'd love for you to talk more about that. Diane described the work of Beloved Community as a journey, and you described your journey, the journey of your congregation towards discipleship and towards this new witness. What were the obstacles? Everyone listening is going to take this home and begin to think about, work on how we do this together. And all of us are going to hit obstacles of one sort or another. Talk about the obstacles to this that you've seen, that you see in terms of the witness of the church going forward.
Well, I think the first obstacle is that we would all rather be comfortable than uncomfortable. You know, and being comfortable means keeping things the way they are as long as that works for you. And as white people, the system works for us. And for my congregation, the system works for the great majority of my congregation. Many of us have pieces of our personal history which connect us to stories of oppression, but in terms of where we are living now, we are in the midst of a world where we are privileged. And so we've got to make a conscious decision to be uncomfortable. And that's part of why I say, for me, the first step really was getting grounded in the Bible and in discipleship. Because it can't just be because I think this is a good idea or I've been awakened to the ways in which I participate in white supremacy and oppression. I need to be able to say, as Patrick was saying, look who Jesus really was and what he did and who he was, because that can sustain me for the long haul. My energy is going to flag. I'm going to get tired. But if I keep going back to my grounding in prayer and in scripture, then that gives me the energy to go forward. I think the other thing, I want to cite something that Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas said on the first day. The first work that we all have to do is the work of remembrance, of really getting honest about our history. Not the history we were perhaps told, not even the history maybe we've tried to teach others, but the actual history, which might be hidden. The fact is that we published a history for our 200th anniversary at St. James Church, and the absence of the Civil War was not mentioned in that history. It was just, it wasn't there, and so it wasn't reported. I don't think probably people reading it would have noticed it. Let's go back and see what's missing in our history. What are the stories that haven't been told? Who are the people whose voices were excluded from the narrative? One of the things I loved when our parishioner, who's an historian, did the presentation in the church about our own history, she made a conscious decision that she would not show any photographs of the white leadership of the church who had been involved in the slave trade. You wouldn't think a big deal, and we could see them and think, isn't that terrible? But she was committed to showing the pictures of the enslaved people they had owned. We actually found some of those pictures and what had happened in their lives. So that was the catechesis, a phrase I love, the catechesis of the visuals. What are you showing people? What are your images telling people about who God is, who we are, what that can mean? And so we need to get honest about our memory and our history, and that's hard work. And, you know, we've all heard the folks who say, well, you know, but let's talk about good cops. Of course, there are good cops, but that's not what we need to be talking about right now. We need to be talking about a system that grew out of slavery and has worked its way into mass incarceration and policing in this country. There's a lot of resistance, but I think if you're really grounded in your faith, you can move there. And then I'm talking too much, but the last thing I want to say, we're talking about the Christian witness. One of the worst things we've done is to cede the word Christian to people who share none of our beliefs or understanding of the gospel. And as Patrick was saying, when the leader of this country can stand in a church and talk about Kung Flu and not have the people in that church be appalled, we have to do some serious work of fighting to reclaim what we say when we say Christian witness.
Christian, how do you see the obstacles?
Thank
Your
you.
advice to people though.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, Reverend Brenda. So helpful and beautiful. Thank you. So I was thinking about, I think one of the obstacles is that we often prefer the certainty of faith over the invitation of faith. So we lean into our religious traditions for certainty, for answers, for clarity. But the invitation of faith actually beckons us into the uncertain space of relationship, of love, of honesty, of discomfort, of risk. What is the demonstration, the example of Jesus, if not risking everything for good? And those are discomforts that I think we often don't associate with our faith. So I think one of the obstacles is sort of cultivating, sort of as leaders, I think in particular, cultivating in our congregations and in those we serve, a propensity for risk, for love, as opposed to a desire for certainty, which will necessarily keep us away from the kinds of actions we have to take to change the systems. The second thing that came up for me is that we confuse a piercing for a shocking. And here's what I mean by that. I think that some of what we've seen in the last 3 months in our country as it relates to racial equity and sort of social unrest, I think particularly from non-communities of color, is a shock. The American consciousness has been shocked by the murder of George Floyd, shocked by the murder of Breonna Taylor, which is, of course, grief that communities of color carry all the time, but sort of non-communities of color have now turned attention and are shocked by those realities. But change that is sustained requires more than a shock. You've got to be pierced by it. You've got to be opened by it in order for the change to last beyond the moment and for us not to find ourselves here 6 years from now. Which, blame it on my cynicalness, even in the midst of my deep belief in beloved community, but I fear without a real witness, which the church can provide, we will find ourselves in this moment again, yet again shocked, but not pierced and not changed. And the last thing I thought I'd offer is there has to be a real desire, I think, to sacrifice our resources. That's our time, our money, our buildings, our homes, to sacrifice our relationships. And by that, I mean to open up our relationships for the good work, our networks, our social capital, our access, all demonstrations of our power and privilege. And I think if we find ourselves in the rhythm of engaging the gospel week after week in church, but we are not turning over the uses of our resources for the good work and for communities who need our resources, if we're not laying our resources down so that communities can build on our resources into a place of greater equity, we have missed the invitation of the gospel. And I think that those sort of those kinds of missteps can be and have been obstacles for us as people of faith in the good work of equality.
Thank you, Christian. Diane, you've seen and helped the church navigate so many obstacles over these last years, and obstacles remain. How do you understand this? It's a question.
Well, I'd like to pick up on what Christian just said, because I also fear that we could easily not continue striving for change if we don't seriously do the work. And I know my friends talk about me, and when I say I'm not saying I'm not a fan of reconciliation, but when I look at reconciliation, I see it as a word that calls us to put back together something that was once together. And I don't think we were ever together. So therefore, I have to unpack this desire for reconciliation. I know it sounds terrible because that's what everyone's calling for, but that's where I come from. So I say that when we start looking at education, when we start looking at something as simple as looking at the vestments that we wear and compare them to other garments that were worn by people who meant no good to us. When we look at the mitre, when we look, one of the, you know, Matt, that one of the books that we read before we went to on our Montgomery trip last year was The Cross and the Lynching Tree.
Yep, James Cone.
And if you can seriously read James Cone's book and not question the motives of the church a long time ago, then you're not reading it in the proper way, to me. So I say, how do we avoid that? How do we change that? The only answer I have is that of telling and acknowledging our own truths. Not condemning other people, but just stating them. That's why I'm so happy about all of these things that are going on this week, because you can't deny some of the truth that is being unearthed. The truth that we have to tell our children. Now, the last 3 new births in my family of nephews and great nephew level have been boys, Black boys. And if you don't think that has an effect on me, you know, if I can't help but say, my God, how long? The fact that we have children going into restaurants and they won't be seated because they have on athletic shorts, you know, and then the denial of someone who's a maitre d' saying that, oh, I didn't realize that. Well, you know, we have to stand up for this. We have to speak our truths. And I believe that the church has a problem in speaking the truths because many of our members will not agree with us. Many of our members are people who think the conversations that are going on are wrong. So therefore, you have to be able to take the risk of hurting someone's feelings. Remembering that when we were in Montgomery, we went to St. John's Church and they talked about the removal of Jefferson Davis's pew.
Right.
And how the result of removing that pew caused them to lose members. Not a lot, but they lost some members who just didn't see it. That's the risk. Are you willing to move it anyway? And they were, knowing that you are going to lose them. So the church has to be willing to take that risk if it's going to be anywhere else. And our bishops are in a position where they minister to people who have both arguments on both sides. So where are they? How are they going to deal with this? How are they going to come to it? God tells us what we should do. Well, if you just read your Bible, you know what we should do, but it's the enactment of doing it. Again, I think that momentum is such that it has to be continued, and we have to keep on going and keep doing this thing. But our church has a lot of work out there to do, has a lot to do, but it can do it. It can do it.
Patrick, how do you understand obstacles in our path at this moment?
I just want to say first how much I appreciate, Reverend Brenda's notion of discomfort and Reverend Christian's notion of risking, uncertainty, and Ms. Diane's notion of truth-telling. As a theologian, I want to talk about one of the dichotomies. We've talked about, sort of how binaries are at the heart of, I think, white supremacy and anti-Blackness. But one interesting binary is sort of progressive communities, and they're sort of being allergic to using traditional categories like sin and evil, right? And I think, I get it. I think many times, people have been the target of that language. But, I think if we look at the flip side of the love of the cross is just the almost sort of endless capacity of humans to be evil, right? I mean, you see that, putting Jesus to death, and you see this in Dr. Cohn's work, right? The Cross and the Lynching Tree. We see this in Dean Douglas's work, right? Stand Your Ground.
Right.
And I think we should not be afraid to talk about evil. We should not be afraid to talk about sin. We need to rethink them, I think. But I think there is something about the tradition that we can draw on, not only scripture, as so many of my fellow panelists have talked about, but the theological tradition, right? So I think that is one obstacle I'd love to see sort of more conversation about. And then Matt, also the notion of silence, right? I sort of grew up San Francisco Bay Area, late 1980s, early 1990s, ACT UP, silence equals death. In terms of the silence and our desire to be genteel and not rock the boat and to be kind, I don't think it's a mutually exclusive binary. I think we can name the truth. I'm really proud of one of our parishioners at St. Thomas, Pamela Lewis, that has recently written 2 articles for Covenant, the blog of the Living Church, one called Yearning to Breathe Free on George Floyd, and another called Toppling Glory about the removal of monuments. So I think we need to model sort of how not to be silent.
Well, so Patrick, in a second, I'm going to invite you to talk about what you hope as we speak up together. But I want to invite now everyone who's joined us to put in chat one word about your hopes, and we're going to share those at the closing worship this afternoon. It's a way in which that as we commit together, listen, pray, act together, that we lift up our hopes and offer them back to God. So I invite you now as we ask this question about hope of our panel for you to share this thing. So Patrick, start off. What do you hope? What makes you hope?
Well, I think it's interesting being in June right now, sort of the intersections of Juneteenth on the one hand, and then Stonewall on the other, right? And what gives me hope is the Black Trans Lives Matter movement. So in the way that in which it weaves together issues of, gender identity, queerness, but also race. I think this cover, this week's cover of Time magazine is a photo of, Black Lives Matter, but it's actually taken at a Black Trans Lives Matter rally, which have occurred all over the country, right? Where this notion, like in Brooklyn, right, with 15,000 people. I think thinking about how race cannot be separated from our bodies and sexualities and gender identities, and also sort of the disproportionate results of violence on certain communities. And so I think seeing that kind of discourse and talking about it really does give me hope. And I think, sort of the intersectional thinking represented by womanist and Black feminist thinkers and and queer of color thinking. I think those are the kinds of things that I think bring hope to me and to my work.
Thank you, Patrick. Christian, how about you? What makes you hope? What do you hope for at this moment?
I very much resonate with what Reverend Brenda said in her first comment, was that we are graced to glimpse beloved community now. And when we experience the realm of God, it won't feel foreign. It'll feel like what we know, because we've already been living it and embodying it here. So that gives me hope. There have been so many instances over the course of my work as clergy, inside, within the four walls of parish and outside of it, where I feel I've glimpsed the grace of beloved community at the bedside of someone transitioning from life to death, on the streets of Ferguson in protest after the murder of Michael Brown. And here recently, as I have watched so many of us awaken and respond. So I feel hope in moments when I glimpse the goodness of beloved community. I'm reminded as well in terms of hope. So Frederick Douglass, a famous speech of his, which many read several weeks ago, actually on Juneteenth or last week, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" And he reflects on African Americans' relationship to the politics and culture of the United States. And he ends that speech by saying that in spite of it all, I have hope. He says, "The arm of the Lord is not shortened." And so that gives me hope, remembering that the love and the arm of the Lord extends long and wide and invites us into this good work. That to me is hopeful.
Thank you, Christian. Brenda, what do you hope for? What makes you hope?
What makes me hopeful personally is the depth of conversations that are now happening, and that people are really willing to engage in. I feel like people are both trying to reclaim their voice in terms of talking about what they don't know, what they have misunderstood, what they have done and need to repent of, and also a real longing for having this country be a different kind of country than it has been. So that gives me hope. But I will say what grounds all of that hope for me is the crucifixion and the resurrection, because that is absolute evil. And I'm all with Patrick. We need to reclaim the world in terms of the attempt to destroy God. And yet God will not be overcome. And the resurrection is all about, it's not over yet, because God is not done with us. You know, Diane was talking about history before, and I still remember that wonderful phrase of Verna Dozier, the dream of God. And we're trying to get to God's dream. And I feel like the real conversations are helping us get there, and the crucifixion acknowledges how awful it's going to be and can be, but the resurrection says God gets the last word.
Diane, we'll give you the last word in this conversation. What do you hope for? What makes you hope?
Okay, what makes me hope is the depth of the conversations that we're having now, and the interest in what appears to be the interest in a large number of people to talk about difficult things, and to do this on an ongoing basis. I'm a devotee and I've studied Frederick Douglass for a long time. I live on Frederick Douglass Circle, and we have a big statue out on the circle where I'm proud to say I had a lot to do with getting it there. And Black Lives Movement comes there and they stand around Frederick Douglass and they sing and they pray almost daily. And I say to myself, what would Frederick Douglass say if he were alive now? And I go back to that 5th of July speech that he made, and that gives me hope. The other thing I would say is that my very dear friend, who died recently, the Reverend Barbara Clementine Harris. She always used to say to me, Diane Pollard, never forget that we are Easter people in a Good Friday world. And that to me gives me hope. Easter will come.
Wonderful, wonderful way to end. Thank you all for the time together. Thank you for your leadership, for your words on this panel, for your witness, both in the world and today, for all of us who are looking for how we take this next step, looking for, as Christian started us off by saying, the conversion of our imaginations, as God has called us to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to be part of this, Matt.
Yeah, great
Great
conversation.
to be with you all.
Yeah. Honored to hear you all. Let me say a word about what's happening the remainder of today. At 5:30, we have an interview that we've recorded with Dr. Catherine Meeks, who is Executive Director of the Absalom Jones Center in Atlanta. Done remarkable work in the diocese, Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta, but certainly nationally a leader in helping us think about these things. And she'll bring back some of the questions that the panel talked about today, including the difference between reconciliation and healing. And so come and listen to that. She, like Diane, looks for healing, not reconciliation. Come back and listen to Dr. Meeks and hear why that is. At 6:30 tonight, we'll have a closing prayers. Dean Kelly Brown Douglas will be our presider. Chuck Winder, who works with the presiding bishop doing really remarkable things around prison reentry, will be the preacher. Janine Otis and Sandra Montez will provide the music. So come back and be part of those prayers together. We're going to offer your prayers for hope in the closing prayers. And then we'll continue to provide resources, opportunities to connect in the days ahead as we continue to figure out how we make this commitment real in our communities, in the lives of our church. I want to say thank you as we close to everyone who's helped produce the pilgrimage over these last days. It's been a great partnership with Episcopal Divinity School at Union. Thanks to Miguel Escobar and Dean Douglas for their work. Anne-Marie Wishker has been the lead organizer for all of Heavenly Rest with this. So thanks to Anne-Marie. Lucas Thorpe, Lucy Bridenthal have produced it. Cindy Strabers has helped coordinate the small groups. It's a wonderful team effort, and we're going to need all of us to co-labor together in the days ahead. Thank you for joining. May God be with you. God bless. We'll see you later today. Thanks again to our panel.